Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 4 with Black Ice, and of course we're playing as Japan. And just before starting the episode, I noticed that our two divisions here are tying up 11, including 9 medium tank templates. As we can see here, that's all of them all stacked up there. All those units up here, and not on the Eastern Front fighting. So yeah, like I said before, I think last week I was tweeting with oh, what's his name, Frederick Wasser. Guess I'm getting that more or less correct. The guy who's the was CEO of yeah, he's no longer was CEO of Paradox. Now he's turned that over to somebody else, and he's sort of, I don't know, passion project guy that he's going to work on certain projects within it. Hello, Arno. Not too much of the gang's here yet, but they're coming, I'm sure. You know, and he agreed with some of my points, but disagreed with my point that Hearts of Iron 4 is fundamentally broken. And I tweeted back about the AI, and the AI is a core element, at least the combat AI is a core element of the game, and something that we can't mod, and I do think it is fundamentally broken still, especially when you have 9 armored, medium armored tank templates, 1 motorized division, and 1 other division hanging out here. I would just I don't know. I don't know how legitimate this is. I know this isn't a very active start to this thing. This is well within sight. It's easily block-offable with artillery on either side of a reasonable caliber, and it's sort of like a super wide river crossing. I mean, that's how Germany saw the English Channel, but the English Channel wasn't that. You couldn't just, you know, get across with a river crossing kind of a thing, but this is very narrow. So this one I totally agree with. I don't know that I agree with this one, being able to go from here to there. I know the one oh, you Germans and your complicated names. What is it? Singer von Etterlung or whatever. I mean, that's his last name or something to that. Now we can see the Americans here are taking out Italy. How nice. Did withdraw from here because he was in charge of the garrison at Sardinia, the German garrison in Sardinia, at a time prior to the Americans landing in Sicily. And then they he withdrew to Corsica, and then from there to Italy, but with his, and did so, yes, Bonsai, hey Azads, good to see you. And with his limited, I don't know, naval assets, because it was German and Italy had basically surrendered at that point, with his limited seaborne assets, shall we say, was able to get his forces out to Corsica, and then from Corsica over to mainland Italy. So whatever his flotation stuff, got all of his equipment out, basically all of his men out without loss. I really admire units that can withdraw in the face of the enemy. You might think that's sort of odd, but I really do admire that ability, because you know, it goes back to Sun Tzu. It goes back to the idea of facing the enemy on your terms, on the best terms, and you know that you have a force out here and you can get it back out. That means it can be employed somewhere else, as opposed to and that's more important to me than a good example would be the Battle of El Alamein on both sides of this. It was, you know, because you got to realize the famous sort of Battle of El Alamein, because there was several sort of scraps around there, but it was a German offensive that was stopped by a very well-developed defensive positions, lots of minefields strewn and all that kind of stuff, and so that ground into a halt also in face of a huge barrage against the offensive. And then there was the British counteroffensive, which did go through the German minefields and also through their own, that they had to clear some of that too. You know, sort of, and it was designed by Montgomery to be let them, you know, wait and let them attack us, because we know they're going to. Once they do, because then that gets them out of their trenches, you get to kill a bunch of them that way, get them off balance. And they're obviously at this time thinking that, yeah, because you're not going to attack a well-prepared position unless you have some reasonable hopes at victory. You know, you're going to stay on the defensive. You're going to do something else. So they thought they could maybe win. Montgomery knew he wouldn't, but knew he could do lots of damage to them at that point, and then counter-attack into them, and does that very well. So you can admire the German and the British commanders for that, fine, but that's a reasonably well planned out, reasonably well coordinated operation. And then we can talk about all the logistical problems that the Italians and the Germans were having, where before, I mean, by the time you're back to El Alamein, most of the major logistical problems, because I believe they even had a pipeline or two laid for fuel and water and whatnot to get up here. So the logistical problems in this region had been solved for Britain. Now Britain was facing massive ones when they were operating way up into here. But, you know, so you can admire generals for that, but to me is to escape with your forces relatively well and intact from a hardship position is something greatly to be admired, because it's not normally something that you want to do, because you're leaving because things aren't so good. You're very right, Azads, that it was, and that comes down to my opinion, a lack of a naval focus for both Italy and Germany, because there is nothing more easy to supply than the coastline. Sure, there's a limited number of harbors, and that is a consideration, but we can see the ability to supply beaches without necessarily huge, you know, D-Day type Mulberry Harbor things, but simply landing craft and other sorts of stuff to bring supplies onto the beach. And I don't know that there was any significantly long stretches of the coast that were unapproachable by landing craft at some point. Oh, I'm not saying that there aren't significant elements that you could point out that would be, but I'm talking about generally along here. So they could have maintained a very good level of supply had they had a better naval focus, and of course to secure that better air focus. That's very interesting. I didn't know that they had camouflage ones like that. IKB. I do know that they obviously buried lots and lots of mines in the sand, and there's still many mines out there to this day that are just sort of reasonably well marked off. But as we're looking here is we're seeing the American mechanized forces, tanks, mechanized infantry are pounding against the Italians, about ready to take Naples. But also, again, we can talk about the seaborne type nature of the American forces here. They've taken Florence, Pisa, some of this, not so much maybe the cities of Pisa and Florence, but some of this area is part of Italy's industrial heartland, I do believe. And they're attacking Rome. It looks like reasonably successfully. And I'm sure they'll be bringing in more forces. And what do we have down here? Oh, they've also taken Minorca, though they may be without a port there. Yeah, looks like they're without a port. Though Minorca should have a port. Well, I hear what you're saying, Azads, but they could have easily built, and they did build, light vessels, the Germans did, and put them straight into the Mediterranean. They, but they could have easily done more so. They could have easily set up and supported assembly of, you know, I'm not thinking even like big Liberty ships. I'm just thinking of, because the Mediterranean, unless you're getting a storm up, it's a pretty calm sea. And there are major storms that will sink a lot of stuff. But the ability which, you know, sort of powered barges, if you will, that could carry troops and supplies for relatively, you know, sort of Mediterranean short distances, the Germans could have done so. There's absolutely no reason they couldn't have. They just didn't think in those terms. And, you know, I've been reading a bunch on the Pacific War. And it really, you know, I think, in 42, you got to remember the war starts in December 41 for the Americans. So in 42, there's one sort of naval aviator of a reasonably good rank, I don't remember his name or his rank, was sort of running around America to a lot of the officials saying, we need 150 aircraft carriers, we need 100, and everybody's like rolling their eyes and going like, yeah, right, how did you come up with that number? And he even supposedly to somebody or something, oh, it just was a good round number to pull out of the air. But he meant to be a large number of aircraft carriers. And you know, everybody was, this is just a wild, outrageous amount of aircraft carriers, 150 aircraft carriers. Well, by the time the war ends in 1945, the Americans had commissioned 115 aircraft carriers, and had the war lasted to the estimated 1947, because that was, I think, sort of one of the war planning's estimations of how long it was going to take at some point. Yeah, I'm not talking that's what they thought it was going to be at the start of 45 or something, but just they thought it was going to last long, the war was going to take longer than that. They may have surpassed 150 aircraft carriers and moved it to, you know, 160 or more. So now a lot of these carriers were like the smaller Jeep carriers, the CVEs and such, that were meant sort of primarily to escort convoys across the Atlantic, but also for air operations, for, you know, beach landings, because they didn't need to be fast, because you were moving alongside troop ships and cargo transports and whatever else to just get to wherever you're going to be landing, in the Philippines and, you know, somewhere in Japan or whatever, and then operate aircraft in support of the beach landings and operations ashore until you could build a localized airbase. So I understand that the Germans could just, I mean, the Americans could just outproduce everybody, literally everybody else at that time in the world. But we can see post-war Japan, definitely starting by the 1970s, to be one of the great industrial powerhouses in the world. So we have what they could produce then, but then we also have the idea of, had you sort of prepared a little bit better, you could easily have changed your focus. Maybe not built 150 aircraft carriers, anybody else, but had built a bunch of lighters and other supply light vessels, not big Tirpitz and Graf Spays and whatever else, and put them into the Mediterranean that take a lot of production, but just build a bunch of light type vessels that can move supplies from north to south. That's my sort of view. It gets back to what I'm sort of noticing with Japan operating in the South Pacific, is sending just enough to get the job done, or their estimation of to get the job done, but finding that that is not enough, so they're sending even more, and that isn't enough, so they're sending even more. Instead of sending it all at once effectively and overwhelming the enemy, they're sending it in piecemeal, which gives the opposition the time to reply to it. From my understanding, the Italians, the German and Italians, whatever you want to call it, sent enough supplies to Rommel to keep his forces well supplied. The problem was, is much of that was sunk. I mean, meaning enough of it left ports, whether, going, late going into Tunisia, early on, coming to here, sort of midpoint coming down via sort of Greece to Tobruk. Enough was leaving the ports, but because of Ultra and the intercepts, they knew the shipping schedules and whatnot, so a bunch was getting sunk. But at no point does it seem that, whether it's the Italians or the Germans, and the operations coming through Greece were a bit more German focused than the Italian. Not that the Italians didn't sail ships this way, but coming along the Greek coast and coming south, they did. But sort of supplies coming through Greece were mostly, coming from Germany through Greece down here. At no time did they realize, oh, well, we're losing X number of supplies, so we've got to oversend supplies. And just before this stream, and I'm not sure why he hasn't showed up yet, I was talking to Django about operations in Barbarossa, and how that they were shifting supplies and shifting some air power and other stuff between the two fronts. And I understand that the German, at the time, the main focus was the East Front, and it was just, well, we're only going to shift off from the East Front the amount that we think is needed and no more, because this is the real war. This is a secondary diversion. Well, yeah, it may have seemed that way, but this was the real war. We can argue, and there's good arguments for, and definitely there were a lot more Soviet soldiers died than American soldiers. There's no doubts about that. And so the Soviet Union was absorbing the main efforts of Germany, no doubt. But in my opinion, the point of decision on victory or defeat in World War II was in the West. That was the decision. And at the point of decision now, whether that is El Alamein, Tunisia, the Sicily landings, the Italian landings, the D-Day landings, for sure by the D-Day landings, that decision that they've gotten ashore and you've broken out of the bridgehead, at that point, Germany is done. Germany is just done, because it now faces a three-front, not a two-front war, and they keep talking about a two-front war. And that is, again, a German fallacy, because, again, this was the Italian front that Germany was just helping on. Wrong. It was because Italy was in the war, and Germany itself had, for various reasons, pressured this region. Yugoslavia would have been happy to be neutral through this whole damn thing, but because of German pressure on Yugoslavia to join the Axis, there is a coup in Yugoslavia that flips it to the Allies. Because of various internal politics, it wasn't just over whether they were going to be Axis or Allies. But so there's a coup, so that draws the Germans in. The Germans are pressuring Bulgaria. And we can talk about, and obviously notice, I'm waiting for the event the national focus that Italy's going to pick, though it's awfully late now, that Italy's going to pick to, oh, well, we're going to go to war with Greece now. But obviously Germany did attack Greece. Italy did attack Greece. And that is a very important thing. But that already comes on the heels of German pressure into this part of the world, into Bulgaria, into Yugoslavia, that needn't have happened. But since it did happen, this does become a German front, because had Yugoslavia and Bulgaria stayed 100% out of the war, I don't know whether Germany could have easily fed in supplies, or whether Italy could have turned the tide. Italy alone fighting against Greece, in the long run, Italy's going to win if it prepares itself and does it right. There's no doubt about that. Now, with British assistance, not just a few divisions ashore, but naval and other things, sinking troop ships and keeping Italy from being able to land any other places, could limit the battlefront. So you don't necessarily have to have large ground commitments by Britain to stop Italy from pushing into other parts of Greece. You can. So this was the southern front, the western front, and the eastern front. By the time it becomes clearly a three-front war, Germany's done. There's just, how long does it take, and how many people are going to die, and what's the post-war world going to look like at that point? But if you don't have an active Western Front, yeah, I know there's garrison troops, and I know this is supposed to be a series about Japan, folks, but sorry, we're going on about this. For the longest time, early on, once you were sort of deciding to go after Barbarossa and Britain's still alone, this really isn't the Western Front. You just need minimum occupation forces, because everyone knows, and especially if you guys have now watched my Hearts of Iron 3 German series, the Ersatz Army and the Wehrkreis, those were large formations of troops of various statuses, meaning often permanent units that had temporary soldiers that were training up to then be fed into combat divisions. But these other divisions could be on a split second become a combat division. They would be with be undertrained, but still they were divisions. So these forces that were both the Ersatz and the Wehrkreis were doing proper good functions, because you need a reserve, not just reserve of divisions that may go to the front at some point, but you need a reserve for manpower and other things that Germany did realize, but not well enough, the idea of rotating of soldiers, of combat stress and whatnot. And sometimes Germany did take stressed out divisions, move them west, and replace them. Hey, thanks for following. I do appreciate that. Just take whole divisions and move them to a quiet area, and rotate divisions. So Germany did understand this, in my opinion, not doing it enough. Now I do also understand that they're being strained on everywhere, so they don't just have a lot of luxury to do this, but they do understand that element of different elements of the reserves, and both as an individual soldier, as in units and whatever else. So the Wehrkreis and the Ersatz Army are doing active and important functions. Even if you're at peace with everybody else, they were doing exactly what they should be doing, and those are enough to keep Britain, the British Empire, from invading Europe until the Americans are in it. They know they can't invade Europe. They know, because the only reason they go into Greece, it's a propaganda and morale that we got to support our ally, but they're only doing it because it's a war with Italy, and at the start of that, Bulgaria is neutral, and I don't know, more or less I think Yugoslavia is neutral at the start of British operations in in Greece. So it is taking, maybe critically, and there's a lot of dispute over this, maybe critically taking forces from the North Africa campaign that should have been there and putting them up here. True, and the British do, even with Crete, they do at both, more so out of Greece, but also out of Crete, do evacuate a lot of their troops successfully. Most of the units are wrecked, as in lost all their heavy equipment and all their trucks, and maybe they get their rifles out, but that's sort of at a minimum. So it's not a complete disaster in any means for Britain, but when they go into it, they know it's sort of a holding action. They know it's sort of a sideshow to what they're mainly fighting, but that's a war with Italy in Greece. Once you add Germany into it, sure, they're fighting and they're trying to hold the passes and all this stuff, but they realize that Germany is going to be able to do enough hammer blows, and Britain doesn't have nearly enough forces to be victorious. They realize this. Now they want to withdraw, and they would like to, I'm sure, withdraw as many Greek troops, though Greece doesn't seem to, and I don't know, I haven't read about their political decisions. I am surprised, especially out of Crete and some other places, that they didn't try to withdraw more Greek troops to Cyprus or to Egypt or other places, to be a Greek army in exile. There were Greek units in exile, but they were not ever very big, and I think they could have, again, I don't know the shipping available, I don't know all the details, but I think they could have moved substantially more out. And part of the decision needs to be made sooner as opposed to at the last moment when you're finally collapsing, meaning you need to get, because there's a lot of Greek shipping, there's a lot of Greek boats of various sizes that are, obviously this is an Aegean-based country, that they got a compass and they can go south, or they can go southeast, or whatever, and they could get there with, 10, 20 soldiers, maybe just one-way trip, not like a D-Day back and forth, but get out a fair number of troops to put them into exile to eventually become a subunit. Hey Django, good to see you. Sorry, I haven't been reading all the chat, but I'll get up there. It would become a subject or a adjunct to the British Army for sure, but would have put a substantial force in being, even for a post-war Greece, to have an army. That's what the Poles wanted to do for Poland, but the Soviet Union doesn't let their army back in, basically. So Britain knows this, and so Britain isn't stupid. So you don't need to have a Atlantic wall when it's Britain versus Germany, even though Germany's, once you go into the Soviet Union, it's only after America is in. America is pushing, or very early on, way too early, is pushing for a Western front. Britain's no. Mediterranean. This partially is just Churchill, but there's other reasons too. Partially, just Britain realizes that there is these, the Wehrkrests, the Ersatz Hares, and just other garrison units and other combat units that are at least temporarily in the West, that you start landing troops, and this I'm talking about in 42. They're nowhere near even the abilities of the time of the Dieppe raid. They're, and the Americans are almost sort of wanting to do it instead of the North Africa landings. And obviously those North Africa landings did come with Higgins boats and landing craft and whatever else. But they learned a lot, and they did okay going ashore against the Vichy French, which really didn't want to fight even the British, though they were really pissed off, and I don't know if quite hated the British at that point, because of Bears Al Kabir, where the British sinks the French fleet and kills thousands of French sailors. But they don't even resist the British invasion too much of North Africa, and they learn more in Sicily and in Italy and whatnot. But America's wanting to go early on here. The British know that come on, guy, you know, it's more like, hey, we're the experts at war. We've been fighting not only this war, but wars for hundreds of years in Europe. We know what we're doing. And the Americans are like, yeah, let's just go today. So the Americans are wrong at that point. But they are right in that the decision is going to be made here in Germany. And they're right that, as we've seen, that the Mediterranean is not, and I've talked about this before a lot, is not the soft underbelly of Europe for geographical infrastructure and other reasons, though it is a extremely long coastal areas to defend, which diffuses your ability to defend it, because you got to put troops everywhere. And so at any one point, you know, you come down into the Peloponnesus down here, there are plenty, and there's probably more ports than this, though they're all really should be like, I think these are, well, it's a level 2, but just really minor ports, you know, fishing ports, enough to bring in some of the smaller landing craft. Now, I'm not talking just like the beach landing craft, but some of the smaller landing ships that you could easily come in and put troops ashore and overwhelm whatever local German, or possibly, I think down in the Peloponnese was an Italian. No, this may have been more German, and the Italians were a bit more occupying up here, I think. But, you know, overwhelming the local defenses, so that way it is soft. But then you're stuck on the Peloponnese, which is actually an island by this point, because they've got a canal through here, though it's just barely wide enough to get a small ship through, at least at that time. So, you know, you're trapped on an island, or you're trapped on a peninsula, or you're trapped, you know, this was a death trap. They did a landing in World War I up in here, and 500,000 men or something, I don't know, some god-awful big number, just becomes a death trap, and so many die of disease and whatnot, more so than combat. And the Central Powers just sort of bottled them up in here, and they were never able to push out just to sort of create a Greek front or whatever in the war. And so it was a miserable, miserable failure, just because these mountains don't do justice to the... They're not necessarily the Rockies or some massive, you know, even the Swiss Alps, but they're rugged, rugged mountains that are, and for whether you're motorized or whether you're still in the World War I phase of wagons, though of course wagons are heavily used in World War II, particularly by the Axis, but to move the amount of food and munitions to operate an army offensively in this part of the world, these are just... there should be more impassable regions around here that just may be from, you know, here to here in ways, but there are, you know, not that even me, who is almost physically fit kind of thing, I'm no physical fitness person, but, you know, could walk over a mountain pass, but you can't supply an army over whatever, you know, getting through the rugged terrain there. So it's not impassable to humans, it's impassable to armies, and particularly motorized armies, so that holding the passes are a critical thing. So in that sense, it's not a soft underbelly of Europe, which is Churchill's thing. Churchill is both wrong and right, as I'm pointing out. Yeah, you can easily get victories, you can easily take an island, you can easily take a peninsula. The British at one point come here and take one or more of these little islands, and then realize, uh-oh, we've taken these islands, and the Luftwaffe is bombing them, and so they evacuate and split back out, because they just can't keep them supplied without... There's just enough German air pressure, and there is not enough Allied air pressure at that point to maintain them. So the threat, and you need to have the reality, like Sicily, of some invasions, but the threat needs to be real, and it becomes a massive defensive problem. So it is a critical front, but it isn't the deciding front, in my opinion. So this is where I think the war is decided. Here in the West, not in the East. Django is becoming my sort of expert on the East, because he's reading a really good multi-volume series on the details of Barbarossa. And so, but like I say, it takes up the great vast majority of German focus, but I don't think is where the decision of who wins or loses is made. You can't argue very much. Stalingrad may be the decision point. you know, of defeating that much of the Germans. You can argue Kursk, the both inability of Germany to destroy a major Soviet army, and plus all of the destruction to the attackers at Kursk. You can argue those points. You know, and I'm not talking just the decision of a campaign, you know, of obviously Stalingrad is the decision point for the Caucasus campaign. I'm talking about the decision point of the war. I think if we were still, if somehow you had stabilized the Western and Mediterranean fronts, say enough air power is put up that precludes any Allied invasions and any massive amounts of resupply of, you know, anything that's already happened, you know, German jets show up and are ruling the air here, you know. I do think the Stalingrad thing is fully recoverable from on the German side. Now, realize the number of troops, now these off, but the greater Stalingrad losses, which include 1 Italian army and 2 Romanian armies and a Hungarian army, if I'm not sure. Now, they were holding the flanks, not fighting in Stalingrad itself, but they were holding the flanks when the Soviet counteroffensive. But when you put all of that together, my understanding, again, I don't remember all the numbers, but I've heard it said on some documentary, so in a responsible source, but they may be wrong or calculating, is about the same number of troops that are lost in the sort of Tunisia bridgehead, and that happens at about the same point in time. So these are 2 massive losses. Now this, in numbers of troops, comes more heavily down on Italy, but then is the sort of final nail in Italy's coffin of any sort of real offensive armies. But taken together, because the army that's sent east isn't too shabby for Italy, you know, as in quality of troops and equipment either. So that sort of really sinks the 2 situations. But in Stalingrad, I think it's recoverable. Here, it isn't recoverable. Not so much that the Allies have defeated and taken the army. What is more important is why they were able to do so is because of, and it's a combination of naval and air power, because if you have all the aircraft in the world, and I'm not talking about airborne paratroop drops, I'm talking about bombers and fighters. If you have all the aircraft in the world, it doesn't get you across any significant amount of water without a navy and amphibious force operations. So, and yeah, thanks for continuing the good comments there, Django. So Navy is just as important as air, but Navy without air gets sunk when you're in close to, you know, land, which all of European waters are. So it's naval and air power, but it's not exclusively one or the other. But you got to have both. But the inability of primarily Italy to be able to keep supply routes open, to be able to control the air, to be able to do all that, because the Allied forces aren't hugely superior in force, if you will. What they're hugely superior in is in logistics, is the ability to keep shooting their artillery guns, because they have ammunition. The Italians and the Germans have artillery pieces. I don't know in North Africa at this point, once Rommel's there in the post-Kasserine Pass kind of thing, who has more artillery pieces. But it really doesn't matter how many artillery pieces there are if you can't keep shooting them, if you can't daily have more ammunition showing up. And that's what really shows, is that the Americans, who are bringing supplies into, I presume, Algiers, I don't think there's much of a rail system operational, at least at this time. I think there is some sort of rail, but not much. Are bringing in enough ammunition to push on here, but the Italians aren't able, or Germans, shipping through Italy, aren't able to bring in enough ammunition of artillery pieces, machine gun ammo, anti-tank ammo, fuel, to keep this force operational. So that is why it loses. And as time goes on, yes, the American allies are building up greater and greater forces. And it's stupid to continue to build up Axis forces, because you can't already supply the ones that are here, and so you just create a bigger and bigger pocket. And so that's why this is not recoverable from, is not because of the ground forces, which are destroyed or captured or whatever. I mean, that is a massive element of it, but it is the air and naval power shows that, okay, once this is done, Italy's done, because this is gonna happen to it. Because if you move the entire Italian army down to defend Sicily, they're gonna land up here, or they're gonna land here, or they're gonna land over here, or they're gonna land out here. They're gonna land somewhere, and you're not going to stop it. You might keep them from landing up here because that's just too far to, you know, with air power and mass boats and a few submarines and whatever, you're going to sink too much. But everywhere else, they're just going to land somewhere, and you can't win. If you can maintain naval or on the defensive in naval operations enough air power to sink it, you can win. But that's already what's lost here. So that is the decision, the final ultimate decision point for the Mediterranean front happens in Tunisia. Okay, well, this is going to end up, as you could quite tell, a special episode, not the episode on Japan. It'll probably be in that series, but it will be labeled something. I'll think of a good name for it. Episode, because we haven't played any games. I hope it was entertaining. Let me quickly scan up through the well, let me end this and then I'll look at the Twitch chat. So thanks for watching, thanks for liking the videos, it really does help. If you haven't already, please subscribe to me on YouTube and follow me on Twitch, and of course please post your comments. You can read what's been said by Azads, Arnos, Django, and a few others, sorry, IKB and a few others on there. I will be reading your comments very shortly. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.